In May 1943, Hitler discovers a truth that no general wanted to hear. The United States was already putting for aircraft in the sky for everyone Germany could produce. On one side, American factories working in 3 shifts, far from the bombs, fed by rivers of steel, aluminum, and fuel. On the other, German hangars under attack, shortages of raw materials, cuts in training, and the Luftwaffe exhausting itself faster than it could be resupplied. How does a commander maintain hope when he realizes that, even while winning individual combats, he is losing the war in the numbers? The generals around that table knew that every squadron shot down would take months to rebuild, while America replaced it in weeks. In silence, many understood that, if industry defined the future of aerial warfare, the equation was already against them. If you want to follow, step by step, how this industrial supremacy crushed the Luftwaffe, subscribe to the channel now and say in the comments, do you think war is decided by factories or by pilots? To understand how a ratio of 4-to-1 could appear in a report on Hitler's desk, the story needs to begin years before that meeting, when American aviation was still modest by later standards. In the late 1930s, the United States did not yet look like the arsenal of democracy. Its aircraft production in peacetime, though growing, was small compared to what was to come, and German rearmament had already placed modern combat aircraft in the skies over Europe. The initial successes of the Luftwaffe in Poland, the Netherlands, and France reinforced a belief in Berlin that a combination of doctrine, experienced pilots, and technical innovation would preserve German superiority in the air. On paper, the balance seemed to favor a well-prepared continental power that had started rearmament earlier and was already at war. Across the Atlantic, however, a different type of preparation was happening. American planners were less interested in winning the first year of a hypothetical air war than in building a system that could expand infinitely once mobilized. Automobile manufacturers were pressured and then compelled to convert their car assembly lines for wings, fuselages, and engines. New plants were designed as vast continuous lines intended to produce thousands of standardized aircraft, and not as small workshops building limited runs of specialized machines. What mattered was not just how many aircraft could be built in 1940 or 1941, but how quickly the entire system could be scaled if war came. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, that system was set in motion. The production curves that had been rising accelerated sharply. In 1942, American factories produced tens of thousands of aircraft. In 1943 and 1944, annual production reached levels that, by themselves, would have placed the United States above any other single power in terms of aircraft production. Bomber plants, fighter plants, and training aircraft lines each contributed to a total that grew quarter by quarter. For German analysts trying to understand this distant industrial mobilization, the numbers were difficult to believe at first. But as more data arrived from public statements, shipping records, and photographic intelligence, they converged on the same conclusion: the United States was outproducing Germany, and the gap was widening. Therefore, in that conference room in May 1943, the report presented not just a one-year comparison, but a trajectory. A table placed German combat aircraft production for 1942 next to American totals, then projected both forward based on known factory outputs and mobilization plans. Even the most conservative estimates pointed to a grim ratio. Measured across all categories of aircraft, including trainers and transports, the United States was already producing several times more aircraft than Germany. Narrowed down to combat types, the situation was more complicated, but still showed an American advantage increasing rapidly. And behind every number was something the numbers could only suggest: a continental economy fighting on a main front, far from enemy bombers. In the leadership of the Luftwaffe, there had long been confidence that quality and doctrine could compensate for differences in quantity. Early in the war, experienced German pilots had achieved high kill ratios, and their aircraft had proven effective against adversaries who were often surprised and disorganized. This history shaped the way many officers interpreted bad news. A difficult month could be explained by weather, by tactics, by local circumstances. But as the war dragged on, every loss became harder to replace. Training courses were shortened, flight hours for new pilots were reduced, and combat units were kept at the front for longer periods without rest. That same quality that had been the pride of the Luftwaffe in 1939 and 1940 began to degrade under the pressure of a prolonged war. On the American side, in contrast, the production of pilots and ground crews was treated as an extension of industrial production itself. The Army Air Forces Training Command established a network of specialized schools, each responsible for a phase of instruction, supported by a constant supply of training aircraft and fuel. Procedures were standardized, curricula were refined based on combat experience, and the system was designed to handle high output without collapsing. Maintenance crews were trained to apply factory-style methods in the field, using interchangeable parts provided through a vast logistics chain. The result was not just more aircraft, but a steady flow of crews and technicians capable of keeping them flying. At this point in the story, the key question for any viewer is simple. If Germany saw these trends, why could it not respond in the same way? Part of the answer lies in geography and resources. German factories were within reach of Allied bombers, especially as the war progressed and more bases became available for long-range operations. Key industrial areas needed to be defended, not just by fighters and anti-aircraft artillery, but also by dispersing production into smaller locations, which reduced efficiency. Germany faced shortages of vital materials and relied heavily on synthetic fuel, which itself became a target of concentrated bombing. Every attempt to protect the industrial base added cost and complexity to a system already struggling at its limits. Another part of the answer is organizational and political. German aircraft production did increase in absolute terms between 1940 and 1944, and in some periods it did so impressively, despite the bombings. But these gains were achieved under intense pressure, with frequent changes of priorities, interference from rival authorities, and constant trade-offs between maintaining current models and introducing new designs. Decision-makers faced difficult choices. Should they push more of an existing fighter, or switch factories to a new type and accept delays? Should scarce fuel go to training units or to squadrons on the front line? None of these dilemmas were unique to Germany, but they were much more severe in a country fighting on multiple fronts with a smaller resource base. American industrial mobilization, in contrast, benefited from earlier decisions to coordinate war production under centralized agencies that could align military requirements with industrial capacity. Plants were built with standardized tooling, suppliers were assigned specific responsibilities, and transport networks were managed to ensure that raw materials and finished parts moved to where they were needed. This did not eliminate inefficiencies or errors, but it meant that the entire system could be scaled without constant improvisation. For the compilers of the 1943 report, this was one of the most disturbing aspects. The American numbers did not appear as extraordinary spikes, but as points along a rising curve that still had room to grow. One section of the report that particularly caught the attention of German officers focused on heavy bombers. These were not simple machines. They required large amounts of aluminum, multiple engines, complex instruments, and numerous skilled workers to assemble. But even taking this into account, American plants were producing heavy bombers in volumes that, when combined with medium bombers and fighters, suggested a total combat aircraft production far beyond what German planners had assumed possible. For the men charged with defending the Reich against these same aircraft, the implication was obvious. Every attack they managed to disrupt might buy time, but unless they could alter the overall balance of production, they were fighting against a tide that would keep rising. By now, the situation can be summarized in a single micro hook. The war in the air was becoming a confrontation between factories as much as between pilots. This does not diminish the courage or skill of the men who flew and fought on both sides. However, it set hard limits on what those men could achieve. A brilliant tactical victory could bring down dozens of enemy aircraft, but if the enemy could replace those aircraft within a month, while you struggled for half a year to rebuild a single squadron, the strategic effect would be limited. In this sense, the 4-to-1 ratio printed in that 1943 document was less a photograph and more a prediction, a warning about where the war was heading if nothing fundamental changed. As months passed after that report, the reality on the ground and in the air increasingly matched the predictions on paper. Large formations of American bombers, now more heavily escorted by long-range fighters, penetrated deeper into German airspace. The defense of the Reich consumed aircraft, pilots, and fuel at a relentless pace. German units still inflicted serious losses in some attacks, but every successful mission cost them experienced crews they could not afford to lose. When updated production numbers arrived later, they showed that American factories not only compensated for these losses, but increased the overall strength of the fleet. Every new set of tables placed before Hitler and his commandos reinforced the impression that they were fighting against an industrial adversary whose capacity they had underestimated from the start. Before we move to the decisive phase of the end of the war, when the decline of the Luftwaffe became impossible to deny, this is a good moment to pause and reflect. If this kind of deep reconstruction, based on documents from forgotten or misunderstood moments of the war, interests you, consider leaving a like and subscribing. This helps this type of long-form, historically grounded content reach more people who still want to understand how the war was actually decided, not just in the cockpits, but in the factories behind them. While the numbers grew on the charts, the reality in the hangars and on the runways made everything much more palpable. On the American side, maintenance units worked in an almost industrial regime within the bases themselves, organized workshops, standardized parts, replacement engines lined up in rows, ready to be installed. When a bomber returned damaged, the question was not if it would be repaired, but how soon. The flow of parts, fed by freight trains, ships, and forward depots, allowed many aircraft to return to the air in days, sometimes hours, after suffering considerable damage. In readiness reports, this was reflected in availability percentages that remained high, even during periods of intense operations. In Germany, the contrast became increasingly visible as the war advanced. Factories and airfields damaged by bombings required constant repairs. Production lines were dispersed into smaller facilities to reduce vulnerability, which brought additional complexity. Instead of a large continuous flow, production came to depend on multiple smaller points, each subject to interruptions due to a lack of parts, energy, or skilled labor. A damaged fighter might wait for a component that took weeks to arrive, and an air group could see its aircraft availability oscillate unpredictably. It was as if two models of aerial warfare were facing each other. On one side, the factory extended to the front line. On the other, a structure that was fragmenting under pressure. But this was still not the most critical aspect. The psychological turning point came when commanders compared the cost of each engagement with the capacity for replacement. In the skies of Europe, the Luftwaffe was still capable of inflicting significant losses on Allied bombers and their escorts, mainly when it managed to concentrate forces and exploit moments of tactical weakness in the adversary. Experienced pilots continued to record victories, and individual kill statistics remained impressive in some cases. However, every successful interception came at a high price in terms of spent fuel, lost aircraft, and pilots wounded or killed. When these reports reached the planning desks, they were placed side by side with production estimates. The United States could replace dozens of bombers in the interval it took Germany to replace a small number of fighters. This asymmetry was also reflected in the capacity to act in multiple theaters simultaneously. The abundant production of aircraft allowed the United States to divide forces between Europe and the Pacific, maintaining large-scale air campaigns on both sides of the globe. While heavy bombers attacked industrial centers and critical infrastructure in Europe, fighters and medium bombers operated in support of ground forces on other fronts. The Luftwaffe, confined to an increasingly narrow defensive position, saw its resources tied to the protection of its own airspace, with little margin for sustained major offensive operations. In retrospect, post-war studies written by German officers and analysts frequently return to the theme of production. Some of these accounts recall the initial disbelief at the American numbers, the feeling that it was exaggeration or propaganda, and the slow passage to a resigned acceptance when the facts accumulated. They describe the way political decisions, misplaced priorities, and delays in total mobilization undermine the Reich's capacity to respond to the industrial escalation of the United States. The introduction of advanced new models, such as latest generation fighters, could not compensate for the difference in absolute volume. An excellent plane, in insufficient numbers, remains insufficient. In parallel, aerial doctrine itself was being swallowed by material reality. At the beginning of the war, the Luftwaffe bet heavily on rapid operations, close support for ground forces, and concentrated attacks that leveraged surprise and local superiority. This model depended on a relatively cohesive air force, with good maintenance and consistent training. As losses increased and production could not keep up with the adversary's pace, this doctrine was replaced by an increasingly reactive posture: intercept where possible, save fuel, choose targets only when the risk seemed acceptable. The strategic initiative in the air was ceded to the Allies, and recovering that initiative would have required a material effort that the German structure no longer had the means to realize. Still, it is important to note that, until the end, many pilots and commanders continued to fight with the conviction that tactical maneuvers, individual courage, and some technological innovations could still turn the tide in specific points. In later accounts, some of them admit that, even while they believed in local victories, they no longer believed in overall victory. The math no longer favored the Reich. The quantity of aircraft that could be lost in a month was not compensated by the quantity that hangars and factories managed to deliver. In contrast, every major Allied operation was planned with the confidence that, even with substantial losses, the industrial base would guarantee just replacement, but the continuous expansion of the fleet. What makes this story especially revealing for today's audience is precisely this tension between the tactical level and the strategic level. In individual combats, the skill of a pilot, the courage of a crew, the precision of an attack could still shine. But, when looking at the big picture, the numbers Hitler saw in that 1943 report already anticipated the outcome of the air war. For American planes for every German one meant, in practice, that the human factor began to operate within limits defined by industry. Bravery could prolong resistance, but not reverse a production curve that continued pointing in the opposite direction. That is why, when speaking of American logistics of abundance, the focus should not be on triumphalism, but on historical understanding. The industrial superiority of the United States in World War II was the result of planning, favorable geography, mobilization capacity, and the integration of different sectors from steel mills and refineries to railroads and shipyards. From the point of view of the enemies, however, this abundance appeared in a cruel and direct form, in reports showing rapid replacements in bomber formations that did not decrease in size despite losses, and in production statistics that seemed to defy any attempt at balance. For those on the side producing less, the sensation was one of fighting against a continuous flow, a kind of endless factory. When one returns to that conference room in 1943, to the table covered with reports and charts, it is possible to imagine the silence that followed the reading of the main numbers. By admitting that the United States produced 4 planes for every German one was not just recognizing a momentary disadvantage, but a change of scale in the very nature of modern warfare. A war in which the assembly line, standardized training, and planned supply became just as decisive as tactics in the air. From there on, every new operation, every defense plan, would be made under the shadow of this ratio. If you made it this far, it is because this type of deep, documentary analysis makes sense to you, so that more people discover these backstage stories based on numbers, reports, and real decisions, not just battle scenes. It is well worth leaving your like and subscribing to the channel now. This helps bring more episodes about forgotten operations, secret reports, and the logistical backstories that really decided World War II.